Jasmine Crockett is on a mission to expose the truth, and Senator Lindsey Graham is standing in her way. When Jasmine uncovers a massive political cover-up involving Graham, the stakes couldn't be higher. With over 15 million viewers tuned in, she fights to tear down a system built on lies and corruption. As Graham scrambles to protect his empire, Jasmine's relentless pursuit of justice threatens to unravel everything. Will she be able to hold the powerful accountable, or will the truth be buried forever? The battle for transparency is about to get brutal. Who will come out alive? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Under the blinding lights of a live political forum, tension crackled like static before a storm. Senators sat in polished rows, papers neatly stacked, voices measured, until Jasmine Crockett moved. Without a word, she reached beneath the desk and pulled out a thick yellow folder, its edges creased, corners battered, spines swollen with documents. In one swift, unapologetic motion, she slammed it onto the table directly in front of Lindsey Graham. The sound echoed, sharp, deliberate, final. The room froze. Journalists stopped typing. Camera crews leaned in. Graham's eyes narrowed, but his hands gave him away. They tightened around the edge of the desk like he was bracing for impact. His smile faltered. This wasn't a political stunt. It was a loaded weapon placed center stage, and Jasmine's silence made it even louder. For a long moment, she didn't speak. She just stared at him, unblinking, unmoving, as if daring him to be the first to flinch. The folder remained closed, but its presence hung in the air like a verdict waiting to be read. The audience could feel it. Something had shifted. This wasn't just a debate, it was a confrontation years in the making. Jasmine had faced years of being underestimated, interrupted, dismissed. But now in front of millions, she had flipped the power dynamic with one simple act. Lindsey Graham, once so smug and composed, now sat across from her like a man realizing too late that the floor beneath him was no longer solid. And Jasmine? She hadn't even said a word. Yet, the silence from the folder's impact had barely faded when Jasmine Crockett moved again. This time with the precision of someone who'd waited years for a single strike. The room, still gripped in the stunned quiet, watched her fingers slip back into the folder. Slowly, deliberately. Her hand emerged holding not a document, not a report, but a photo. One photograph. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. With her chin high and eyes steady, Jasmine raised the image between her fingers, angling it toward the cameras, the press row, and the stunned congressional aides frozen in their seats. It wasn't pixelated or vague. It was crystal clear. Senator Lindsey Graham, captured under the cold yellow glow of a side street security light, standing outside the rear entrance of Armitage Strategies, a lobbying firm tied to multiple federal investigations. The timestamp glared from the corner, 11:43 p.m. on the night of a government bidding scandal that had redirected $12 million in federal contracts. His posture was relaxed, his expression smug. He wasn't just there, he was comfortable being there. Jasmine held the photo like it was a piece of a much larger machine, an opening lever that would unhinge the entire room. For a few breaths, she said nothing, letting the image do its quiet violence. People didn't blink. Even Graham's aides, seated behind him, shifted in their chairs. Then came his voice, low and rehearsed like a shield he'd worn too many times. "You've got nothing," he muttered, cool as glass. "That's Photoshop, a smear tactic. I've seen better deepfakes from teenagers." He reached for the water glass in front of him, but his fingers hesitated before touching it. Jasmine lowered the photo just slightly, enough to meet his eyes across the table. "You think that's fake?" she asked, her tone soft but laced with static, like the hum before lightning strikes. "Is that how far removed you are from the truth now? That you can stare at your own shadow and call it theater?" The silence that followed didn't feel still. It felt compressed, as if the air had thickened with unspoken truths. Jasmine wasn't finished. "You've spent your career making people like me justify our presence, our voice, our right to speak truth to power." Her voice didn't rise, but it sharpened. "Every time I asked a question, you dodged it. Every time I asked for a vote, you buried it. And now, when the facts finally catch up to you, all you can say is fake? Her eyes burned through him. Senator, if reality offends you, maybe the lie wasn't what was fabricated. Maybe it's been your version of integrity all along. A low murmur crawled across the crowd. Reporters turning to each other, staffers checking their phones, whispering names and timestamps. But Jasmine didn't break gaze. She didn't gloat. She didn't flinch. Because beneath the photo, beneath the accusation, was something colder, deeper. This wasn't just about one night. It was about a lifetime of men like him never being held accountable until now. The silence that followed Jasmine's last line wasn't relief. It was a prelude. The air hung thick, not with applause or outrage, but with realization. Slowly, methodically, she reached into the folder again. Her hand returned holding a printed email. The paper slightly curled at the edges from how long she'd been waiting to use it. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "This is from April 28th, she said calmly, holding it up for the moderators. An internal message from a senior aide to Senator Graham. She began to read aloud. "We need this shut down. The whistleblower's timeline overlaps with the leak. Options, NDAs, or exit package. Run it through discretionary to keep it clean." A low murmur swept through the room, heads turning, backs stiffening. Jasmine let the words hang in the air, like smoke after gunfire. She didn't look at Graham yet. Instead, she laid the email flat on the table, then produced another. This one was stamped confidential, but she had obtained it through an anonymous submission, verified, time-stamped, and cross-checked. "May 2nd, she continued, voice tightening just slightly. Subject line, Athena Protocol, immediate transfer." Her finger dragged beneath the line item that read, $137,500, marked as community infrastructure reimbursement. But there's no record of this going to any community project. In fact, the recipient was a shell firm, set up 12 days prior, dissolved 3 weeks later. Jasmine tapped the top corner. Registered to a P.O. box in South Carolina, the same city where the whistleblower was relocated under a gag order. Now she looked at Graham, squarely. Her eyes were steady, but something had shifted. The room felt smaller, tighter. "You move money," she said, her voice not accusatory, but surgical. "You hid it in the folds of bureaucracy and paperwork. You thought it would vanish like all the others." She reached for one last document, thicker, heavier, signed, sealed. But she didn't vanish. Jasmine unfolded the notarized affidavit and held it aloft, letting the seal catch the studio lights. "She wrote this, in her own words, about how your staff pressured her to stay silent, and when she refused, they bought her silence with federal money." A gasp, uncontainable this time, rippled through the audience like a snapped wire. Jasmine's hand trembled, not from nerves but from the weight of long-delayed justice. "She gave me this a year ago. I waited, hoping the system would work, that someone else would act." Her voice cracked, not from weakness, but from fury honed into restraint. "But nobody came, so I brought it here." She dropped the affidavit beside the other pages, a final piece in the puzzle no one wanted to see completed. Across from her, Graham didn't move. His face was a mask, but his fingers twitched beneath the table. Because Jasmine Crockett hadn't just accused him. She had mapped it, named it, proved it. And in doing so, she didn't just disrupt the room, she turned it into a courtroom, and the evidence was screaming. The pages on the table hadn't even stopped rustling when Lindsey Graham leaned back, drawing a slow, practiced breath, as if he'd been waiting for this moment to play a different kind of card. His voice came low and smooth, the tone of a man who believed he could still reclaim the room with posture alone. "You've made your point," he said, eyes narrowing on Jasmine. "You've stacked your papers, delivered your monologue, had your cameras rolling." He gestured toward the evidence like it was nothing more than dramatic decor. "But let's not pretend this is about justice. It's about resentment. You've wanted this microphone since the day you walked into Congress, because deep down this isn't about right and wrong, it's about me, and your grudge." A few people shifted in their seats. He pressed the moment harder. "This is a political hit job, and frankly, it reeks of desperation. The heat didn't move Jasmine. It clarified her. She stepped forward, not raising her voice but tightening it with a force that felt atomic. "I don't fight from resentment, Senator," she said, her eyes cutting clean through him. "I fight because I remember what it feels like to be unheard." Her words came crisp, unflinching, and in each syllable was the weight of every time she had been told to wait her turn. "Because while you were busy cutting backroom deals under marble ceilings, I was watching communities collapse under policies signed with pens like yours." She leaned in just slightly. "You want to talk about hate? Let's talk about systems built to erase people who look like me, sound like me, rise like me, and how you've made a career of preserving those systems with a smile." Graham's face remained composed, but his fingers began to tap the table, too softly for cameras, too nervously for denial. "Oh, please," he muttered. "Don't give me the moral crusader act. Everyone in this town plays the game." Jasmine didn't back down. Her voice dropped lower. "You're right. This is a game. But the difference is, I didn't come to win. I came to change the damn board." The room tightened again. "You think you've got the monopoly on dignity because you've worn the same flag pin for 20 years? Let me tell you something, Senator. Wrapping corruption in tradition doesn't make it patriotic. It just makes it quieter." Her voice trembled for the first time, not from weakness, but from carrying the full weight of truth under fire. "I didn't come for you. I came for what you represent. And if that makes you uncomfortable, then maybe you were never standing on principle, just hiding behind it." The room didn't move. The silence wasn't neutral. It was choosing sides. And for the first time all evening, Graham didn't speak. Because there was nothing left to dismiss when a woman who had once been talked over was now the loudest force in the room, without ever raising her voice. Jasmine's steady hand pulled the final documents from the folder, the sound of paper sliding against paper, sharp and deliberate, like the ticking of a time bomb. For a moment, the room stood frozen, every eye locked onto her as she slowly unfolded the first page. Her gaze, cold and unwavering, never left Lindsey Graham. She didn't need to say anything yet. Her eyes spoke volumes. Slowly, methodically, she began to read aloud, her voice low but unmistakable. "This is a record of financial transactions, all signed by your office or affiliates. This," she said, holding the paper up for all to see, "is a list of wire transfers, large sums, routing through offshore accounts, moving millions from construction firms to entities that don't even exist on paper, a series of ghost companies, none of which appear to have any legitimate purpose except to funnel money straight back to your donors." She let the silence settle, letting the weight of her words land. The first paper was followed by another, this one a series of contracts for land purchases that seemed entirely out of place. The properties, vast tracts of land in remote areas, had been suddenly developed under new, amended zoning laws. What had been wild farmland was now classified as prime real estate, land that, with the right construction contracts, could yield millions in profits. "But here's the kicker," Jasmine continued, her voice tightening with the sting of betrayal. "You authorized these changes, didn't you, Senator? Without any oversight, without any input from the communities who would be most affected. The zoning laws were changed just enough to allow these properties to be bought and sold at a significant profit. And who got the contracts?" She flipped to the next page, names of companies whose ties to Graham's allies could not be overlooked. Funny how those same companies conveniently became the sole bidders for these properties, a match made in the backrooms of Washington, but we're all seeing it now. The crowd, a mix of media elites and political figures, remained unnervingly still. The tension was palpable, the weight of Jasmine's words sinking in. As she flipped through the pages, she pulled out something darker, more insidious. A list of kickbacks embedded within seemingly innocent financial dealings, companies that were awarded federal contracts for public infrastructure, only to return a portion of those funds as consulting fees. It's neat, isn't it? A little tax break here, a little consulting fee there, and no one ever looks twice. Her voice is still steady, had a venomous edge now, as though each sentence was a strike, each word another blow against the facade Graham had spent years carefully constructing. The studio began to stir. Jasmine let the documents fall across the table like a final testament, a damning series of pieces falling into place, undeniable and unforgiving. The first whisper rippled through the audience, like the first tremor before an earthquake. The cameras flashed relentlessly, capturing every shift in Graham's face. His composure had started to crack, his usual confidence replaced by the unmistakable glint of panic in his eyes. He could no longer play the role of the calm, collected politician. Jasmine's revelations had peeled away his veneer, and now what lay underneath was raw and vulnerable. Still, Graham fought to regain control. He shifted in his seat, adjusting his suit, but the gesture felt forced, desperate. His voice came out flat, though the words were pointed. "This is all just hearsay," he said, trying to maintain his usual aura of authority. "You've pulled out a bunch of disjointed papers and twisted them into something they're not. You have no proof. These are nothing but half-baked accusations and baseless insinuations." Jasmine didn't flinch. She knew exactly what he was doing, trying to discredit the very evidence she had laid bare for all to see. But she was done with playing by his rules. The games were over. "No, Senator," she replied, each word deliberate, sharp. "What you've just seen isn't a smear campaign. It's not some political hit job. It's the truth. And truth doesn't need you to defend it. It stands on its own." Her eyes cut across the room, scanning the audience. "Look at the paperwork. The transfers, the contracts, the kickbacks. It's all there, Lindsey, right in front of you. The truth isn't my enemy, Senator. It's yours." Her gaze returned to Graham, unyielding. He opened his mouth to speak again, but Jasmine cut him off with a quiet force. "How many more people have to be hurt by the system you've built? How many lives need to be manipulated for you to stay on top?" The crowd was beginning to feel it now, an uneasy stir spreading among the audience as they realized the depth of the corruption being laid bare. No longer was this just a politician in the spotlight. It was a system, one that used its power to exploit, to silence, to bury the truth for profit. And the man at the center of it all had just been exposed, with nothing but lies left to stand on. The whispers grew louder. Some heads turned away from Graham, their loyalty now uncertain. A few, those closest to him, shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes betraying the quiet doubt creeping into their minds. One by one, the cracks in Graham's defense spread like fissures in ice. His supporters, once staunch and unwavering, were beginning to waver, not just in doubt, but in disappointment. Jasmine had done more than uncover evidence. She had exposed the very foundation of Graham's power, a house built on lies, funded by the silence of those who should have known better. And now, for the first time, it was crumbling. The shift in Lindsey Graham's tone was subtle, but unmistakable, an instinctive retreat dressed in rationalization. Gone was the aggressor who had thrown barbed lines and rhetorical traps. What stood in his place now was a man fumbling to wrap himself in the language of pragmatism, as if moral decay could be justified through repetition. "Let's not pretend," he said, his voice strained, his eyes flickering across the room. "Politics was never meant to be pure. It's compromise, it's backroom deals, trade-offs. That's how things get done, always has been. You think you're going to change it by wagging your finger and throwing papers? This isn't some college ethics seminar. This is Washington. You survive by bending, by knowing when to look the other way." The words poured out too fast, like he was trying to convince not just the room, but himself. A trace of sweat clung to his brow now, catching the stage lights in a way that hadn't happened earlier. But Jasmine didn't blink. She absorbed every word, every syllable twisted into weary justification, and when she spoke, her voice wasn't raised, but it carried like a war drum in a silent battlefield. "You just admitted it," she said, her tone surgical, stripping the veneer off his defense. "You want us to believe that rot is just routine? That because the game's always been rigged, we're all supposed to pretend it's noble. But let me tell you something, Senator. Filth that's been there long enough doesn't stop being filth. It just gets more comfortable to sit in." Her words sliced deeper now, the restraint in her voice giving them more gravity than shouting ever could. "You say compromise like it's courage, but there's nothing brave about letting people suffer so you can keep your hands clean. That's not politics. That's cowardice wearing a flag pin." Graham's jaw twitched. He tried to speak, but nothing came out at first. His tongue darted across his lips, searching for the next line that might undo the damage. But Jasmine had already exposed the cracks, and the light was pouring in. The audience, now fully captivated, leaned forward, not out of curiosity, but reckoning. Jasmine didn't give him space to reset. "And don't insult us by pretending this is how it has to be," she continued, her eyes locked on his. "The system didn't corrupt itself. Men like you did that. Men who confused survival with servitude, who thought staying in power was more important than telling the truth." Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with the tension of a dam held too long. "I didn't run for office to fit into this mess. I ran because I was sick of being told that injustice is just part of the equation." Graham leaned forward again, trying to reclaim his ground with forced composure. "You speak like an outsider, like someone who's above it all. But you're here too, Congresswoman. You've voted, you've made deals, you've played the game." His voice grew sharper again, like he was grasping for a rhythm that had already left him. "Don't stand there pretending you're cleaner than the rest of us." But Jasmine only stepped closer, her shadow now casting over the table. "The difference, Senator, is that I haven't forgotten who I serve," she said, her voice now laced with steel. "I know compromise. I've done it when I had to. But I've never sold the truth to protect a lie. I've never rewritten a vote in exchange for silence. And I damn sure haven't rewritten morality just to stay relevant." Her final words rang like a verdict. "You don't get to hide behind everyone does it anymore. Not when lives are destroyed by your indifference." And in that moment, under the harsh lights, in front of millions, Graham blinked. Not from the glare, but from something deeper. The sting of a man who realized the power of his title was no longer enough to protect him. Not from the truth, and certainly not from her. The silence in the room thickened as Jasmine slowly placed the prepared resignation letter on the table, her movement deliberate, almost surgical. The crisp sound of paper against wood seemed to punctuate the tension in the air, hanging like a challenge, a statement without words. Graham's eyes flicked down to the letter, and for a moment his usual confidence faltered. His face, so accustomed to projecting control, betrayed a brief flash of doubt, a hesitation that could not be hidden. The letter wasn't just a formality, it was the culmination of everything that had been building in the past few minutes, the choice he would have to make in front of the eyes of the world. The calm, unwavering stare from Jasmine told him everything he needed to know. The game was over, but it wasn't he who would decide the end. Jasmine watched him carefully, her gaze never leaving his face. She didn't need to say a word. The letter was more than just a piece of paper. It was the execution of a plan that had been laid out with precision. It was a reflection of the evidence she had shown, of the truth she had brought to light. He could no longer ignore it. His fate, or rather the fall of his empire, was sealed in those few pages. For a long moment, Graham did nothing but stare at the letter. His fingers twitched at his side, the only indication that he was struggling to maintain some semblance of control. The room seemed to hold its breath, and then, with an effort that seemed to drain him, he spoke, his voice uncharacteristically flat. "I won't sign it," he muttered, trying to mask the unease creeping into his tone. The words, simple and resolute as they seemed, carried an air of desperation, an attempt to reclaim something, anything, from the spiraling loss of authority. Jasmine didn't react immediately. She just leaned back in her chair, her posture relaxed, her expression one of quiet authority. She didn't need to push. He had already exposed himself. "Of course you won't," she replied, her voice calm but cutting. "You can't afford to admit it, can you? You'd rather risk everything than face the truth. It's easier to keep hiding than to be honest about the damage you've done." Her words landed like a hammer, each sentence punctuating the undeniable truth that hung between them. Graham's eyes shifted uncomfortably, the facade cracking further. He tried to reassert himself, but it was clear that Jasmine's words had struck at something deeper, something that no amount of political spin could cover up. "You know," she continued, her voice now laced with quiet fury, "your refusal to sign doesn't make you a hero. It doesn't make you a defender of some noble cause. It makes you a coward. You can sit there and pretend that your silence is some grand political strategy, but everyone can see it for what it is: fear, Graham's breath came a little quicker now. His fingers drummed on the table, the only outward sign of the internal panic starting to unfurl within him. The ground beneath him was shifting, and he could feel it, like the slow crumbling of a dam under the weight of the truth. He looked out at the room, at the faces of his colleagues, his supporters, the people who had once rallied behind him, and saw the doubt starting to form. They weren't looking at him with admiration anymore. They were looking at him with something much worse: suspicion. He cleared his throat, attempting to reclaim some of his earlier composure, but it was a hollow sound. "You've got it wrong," he said, trying to steady his voice, but there was no conviction in it now. "This isn't about courage or fear. This is about something bigger. Politics is about survival. You think you can fix everything with your righteousness, but you don't understand how it works." His voice was barely above a whisper now, but the words felt weak, like a last grasp at control he no longer had. Jasmine wasn't swayed. She leaned forward, just slightly, closing the distance between them. "Don't you dare," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "Don't you dare make this about survival. Don't you dare pretend that you're doing this for anyone other than yourself. The truth is, you've spent your career hiding behind that excuse, behind those words. It's how politics works. But guess what, Lindsey? That's not how it works anymore. Not with me. Not today." The words hung in the air, cutting through the room like a knife, leaving Graham exposed and vulnerable. His facade had cracked, the mask slipping to reveal something far darker beneath. He was no longer the untouchable senator, the man who had mastered the art of manipulation and deceit. He was simply a man, backed into a corner by the weight of his own actions. Jasmine's eyes never left his. She had him, and she knew it. She had done what she had set out to do. Graham was no longer in control of the narrative. He was merely a spectator in his own downfall. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, as the weight of his refusal to act, to sign, became the loudest confession he could ever give. His inability to deny the accusations, his refusal to confront the truth, was the final nail in the coffin. The silence was no longer a choice for him. It was the sound of everything he had worked for slipping away. The aftermath of the broadcast was a seismic shift, felt not just within the confines of the hearing room, but rippling outward into the digital universe. As the live feed cut to commercials, the nation held its collective breath for just a moment before the storm broke loose. What had just transpired in that room, the quiet but deadly unmasking of Lindsey Graham, became the spark that set the political landscape ablaze. Social media exploded almost immediately. The confrontation between Jasmine and Graham, a moment so charged with tension, found its way into every corner of the internet. People watched, replayed, and shared the footage obsessively. It wasn't just the words being exchanged that captured attention. It was the sheer weight of the silence that followed. Graham's failure to even make a single attempt at defending himself spoke volumes, and the world was listening. His face, betraying an unmistakable flicker of panic, was captured in those final moments, and the world saw what few had ever dared to question. He was exposed, vulnerable, and scrambling to maintain his composure. That single moment became the spark that set fire to a political wildfire that could not be contained. Within minutes, the video had gone viral, circulating at an unstoppable pace across platforms. Twitter feeds lit up, Facebook walls were flooded, and even Instagram's typically non-political space became a battleground for this sudden political storm. Every time someone hit share or retweet, the story gained momentum. People from all walks of life, from everyday citizens to political commentators, were commenting, sharing their thoughts, and demanding accountability. The usual political games, rhetoric and denial, were no longer enough to shield Graham. His refusal to sign the resignation letter, the emptiness in his deflections, spoke volumes. The words Jasmine had spoken cut through all of the usual political noise, and now the world was watching. As the hours ticked by, the media outlets began to shift their focus. The 30-second clip of Jasmine calmly laying out the evidence against Graham became the centerpiece of news cycles, replayed over and over again on every major network. It was impossible to ignore. For once, the story wasn't about political spin or media manipulation. It was about the raw truth of power, corruption, and accountability. The more the video was shared, the more Graham's grip on the public narrative slipped, the cracks in his carefully crafted image becoming undeniable. The calls for action began to flood in almost immediately. Citizens, pundits, and political activists alike started demanding that a full, independent investigation be launched into Graham's dealings. They wanted to know more. They wanted to know how deep the corruption went, how many lives had been ruined by the abuse of power. The simple, undeniable fact that Graham had not denied a single accusation lodged against him, his refusal to even attempt a defense, was all the public needed. It was as though the veil had been ripped off and suddenly everyone could see the emperor had no clothes. Citizens began calling their representatives, demanding an independent investigation. Phone lines at news outlets were overwhelmed, and government offices received thousands of inquiries about what actions would be taken next. The message was clear. The public was no longer satisfied with the usual political standoff or evasion. This wasn't a case of partisan politics anymore. This was a case of moral integrity, and the country was watching. The same people who had once blindly supported Graham now found themselves questioning his actions, wondering how long this charade had gone on under their noses. In offices, in cafes, in homes across the nation, people started talking. What had Graham been hiding? How far did the web of corruption stretch? Jasmine had shown them a glimpse, but the public wanted to see more. They wanted to see it all, laid bare for the world to witness. The quiet revelations Jasmine had brought to light were now a full-fledged call to action, and the people were answering. They were demanding more transparency, more answers, and the accountability that had been so long overdue. Television networks, once dominated by the same tired faces and political spin, began to feel the pressure as well. Producers scrambled to get experts on the air, to dissect every detail of the video, to break down the facts and provide context. The clip of Jasmine confronting Graham played over and over again, each time carrying more weight. News anchors, once known for their neutrality, now spoke with a sense of urgency, as if they too had seen something they couldn't ignore. For once, it seemed that the media was doing its job, not to shape the narrative, but to expose it for what it truly was. The fight wasn't just for political dominance. It was for the soul of the country, for the integrity of its leaders. This moment, this single exchange, had become a turning point. The idea that corruption could be swept under the rug had suddenly become unacceptable. Graham's attempts to minimize the situation, his feeble attempts to twist the narrative, were failing. Public trust, once his shield, was now shattered. The public wasn't just watching anymore. They were demanding action. And the more the story spread, the more the pressure mounted. There was no place left for Graham to hide. His silence, his unwillingness to face the truth, was no longer a position of strength. It was a sign of guilt, a confession in its own right. Political figures from both sides of the aisle began to speak out. Some called for immediate action, others voiced their concerns over the deeper implications of the accusations. But one thing was clear: the status quo was no longer acceptable. There was no turning back now. Graham could no longer manipulate the narrative. The people had spoken. The truth, once hidden behind layers of deception and power, was now a public demand. Every hour that passed, the voices calling for justice grew louder. And Jasmine? She stood at the center of it all, unwavering, the embodiment of the truth that so many had been too afraid to speak. She had sparked the fire, and now it was spreading across the nation, a force that couldn't be contained. And as the world turned its gaze to Lindsey Graham, he knew it. His career, built on years of manipulation and secrecy, was crumbling in real time. There was no escape, no spin. The truth had found its way out, and it was now up to him to face it or be consumed by it. The waves of outrage that had surged across the nation following Jasmine's explosive confrontation with Graham were still rippling through the halls of Congress. But Jasmine, ever the strategist, wasn't content to let the momentum die. She knew the time had come for something more, something that would force the system to confront its darkest truths. The world had seen what happened when power went unchecked, and she was ready to put a stop to it. She wasn't just going to expose the rot, she was going to change the system itself. The moment she stood in front of the congressional chamber, holding up a bold new piece of legislation, the air shifted. Her voice, steady and resolute, echoed through the halls, carrying the weight of the moment. "I propose the Public Integrity Act," she declared, her words cutting through the air like a sword. "A bill that will hold every member of Congress accountable for their financial dealings. A bill that will ensure full transparency, because if we're going to restore trust in our government, we have to start by holding ourselves accountable." The words hit the room with the force of a thunderclap. For a moment it felt as if the world stopped spinning. Every eye in the chamber turned to her, and the tension was palpable, thick with disbelief and anticipation. This wasn't just another political maneuver. It was a direct challenge to the very core of the establishment, a direct assault on the corruption that had festered for years. Jasmine had thrown down the gauntlet, and now it was up to those in power to decide whether they would pick it up or retreat into the shadows. At first, the response was predictable. Some of the usual players, those who had grown comfortable in their positions of power, sneered and whispered among themselves, dismissing the proposal as little more than an empty gesture. But Jasmine wasn't fazed by their dismissals. She knew the truth of what she was up against, and it only strengthened her resolve. This wasn't going to be easy, but she had faced harder battles before. She had stood toe-to-toe with some of the most powerful figures in politics, and each time she had come out stronger. This moment would be no different. What she hadn't expected, though, was the sudden shift in the room. The murmurs of doubt and dismissal began to quiet as a group of bipartisan lawmakers stood, one after another, and voiced their support for her bill. It started with a few cautious endorsements, then built into a groundswell of approval. These were people who had once been part of the same system Jasmine was now challenging, yet here they were, standing with her. There was a sense of urgency in their voices, as if they knew the time for change had arrived, and they couldn't afford to sit idly by any longer. It wasn't just the usual allies either. Some of the most staunchly conservative members of Congress were speaking out in favor of Jasmine's proposed bill. The shock was palpable, but so was the electric energy that rippled through the room. This wasn't just about one politician. This was about something much larger, something that could break the chains of the system and reset the power balance for good. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was a glimmer of hope that real change could be achieved. The room, once divided, was now beginning to unite under the banner of integrity. Lawmakers who had spent years turning a blind eye to the corruption, the cronyism, and the secret dealings were now being forced to face the truth. Jasmine's proposal had become the rallying cry for the disillusioned, for those who had long watched the system fail its people and realized that it could no longer be ignored. They were standing with her not just because it was the right thing to do, but because they could no longer deny that this was the only way forward. Jasmine stood tall, her heart pounding in her chest as she watched the sea of people begin to shift. The political tide was turning, and for once it wasn't in favor of the status quo. She could feel the weight of this moment, the historical significance of it. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every person who had ever been let down by a system that was supposed to protect them. This was for the ones who had been silenced, for those who had seen their voices drowned out by the powerful. This was for the people who had trusted that their leaders would act in their best interests, only to find out they had been betrayed. As the support for her bill continued to grow, the realization began to sink in. This wasn't just a political statement, it was the beginning of something much more profound. Jasmine had given the people something they hadn't had in years: hope. Hope that the government could be held accountable. Hope that the rich and powerful no longer had a monopoly on the truth. Hope that real systemic change could actually happen. And for the first time in a long time, the American people were starting to believe that it could. But as the momentum continued to build, there was still a long road ahead. Jasmine knew that not everyone would be on board. The pushback would come, and it would be fierce. She could already hear the whispers of the powerful figures who would try to bury her bill, who would try to discredit her at every turn. But she had been here before, and she knew exactly what needed to be done. She wasn't going to back down. Not now. not when the stakes were higher than ever before. The battle for integrity had only just begun, but Jasmine was ready. She had ignited a fire, and now it was up to the rest of the nation to keep it burning. What came next would be up to the people, the lawmakers, and the ones who had the power to change the system. But Jasmine knew one thing for sure. This was no longer just about one bill. It was about rewriting the rules of the game. And she wasn't going to stop until that was done. This wasn't just a political fight anymore. It was a fight for the soul of the nation. And Jasmine Crockett was leading the charge. The shock wave of Jasmine's proposal had barely begun to settle when the next bombshell dropped. Lindsey Graham, despite the pressure mounting on him from every corner, refused to resign. His stance was clear. He would not bow to the pressure. But while he clung to his position, his power began to slip away. The Senate Judiciary Committee, the very committee that had been his stronghold, took swift action, and Graham was promptly removed. It wasn't a resignation, not a fall from grace in the traditional sense, but it was a devastating blow to his influence. The committee, where so many important decisions had once been made at his command, was now out of his reach. His days of running the show were over, and everyone in Washington knew it. Jasmine watched this unfold with a sense of quiet satisfaction. She had faced so many obstacles to get to this moment: political maneuvering, public criticism, and the countless hours spent in the shadows, unrecognized. Yet here she was, standing as a witness to the unraveling of the very system that had sought to silence her. Graham's fall, though not complete, was still a victory. The power he once wielded with such ease had been wrested from him piece by piece, and it had been her hand that had struck the first blow. The next move in her fight, however, was even more significant. With the Senate's decision to remove Graham from his position, the records Jasmine had meticulously compiled, the emails, the financial documents, the whispered conversations, were now set to be made public. Her files, once tucked away in the dark recesses of the political world, would now be available for all to see. The truth that had been buried for so long was no longer just a quiet whisper. It was now a roar that the world could no longer ignore. Jasmine stood as the orchestrator of this revelation, the keeper of secrets that no one had dared to speak aloud before. The shift in power was not just political, it was personal for many. For Graham, his reputation was now tarnished beyond repair. His allies, once loyal, now found themselves distancing themselves from him, unwilling to be tainted by the scandal that had engulfed him. His refusal to step down, to face the truth of his actions, had sealed his fate. But the damage wasn't just to him. It reverberated through the very fabric of the political world. The Senate, for all its power and prestige, had been forced to confront its own vulnerability, its own corruption. The layers of deception that had once protected Graham were now stripped away, revealing the rot beneath. Yet while Graham may have lost his position, the story was far from over. Jasmine's files, the damning evidence she had collected, were now stored in public archives for the world to scrutinize. What had once been secret was now open for all to see. The truth was no longer a weapon held in the hands of a few powerful players. It was now in the hands of the people. The documents, the evidence, and the records would serve as a constant reminder of the political games that had been played in the shadows. They were no longer just Jasmine's secret. They were now the property of the public, available for anyone who sought the truth. The significance of this moment couldn't be overstated. For the first time in a long time, the system had been forced to reckon with its own failures. The political establishment, which had so often evaded scrutiny, was now standing naked before the people. The files that had once been tucked away in secret rooms were now a matter of public record, a permanent part of history. And as the news spread, as the public absorbed the weight of Jasmine's revelations, there was no turning back. The genie was out of the bottle, and it was not going to be put back. For Jasmine, this was not just a victory. It was a confirmation of everything she had fought for. She had faced down the most powerful figures in Washington, and though the battle was far from over, she had made her mark. The corrupt system that had been allowed to flourish unchecked was now under siege, and Jasmine was leading the charge. Her files were not just a collection of documents. They were a symbol of resistance, of truth, of justice. They represented the breaking of chains that had held the political system captive for far too long. The public response was overwhelming. The media, once hesitant to question the establishment, now had no choice but to cover the unfolding story. News outlets across the country began to pour over the details of the documents, revealing new connections, new revelations that had been hidden for years. Calls for investigations grew louder, and citizens rallied for accountability. This was no longer a partisan issue. It was a fight for the soul of the nation, a fight to reclaim the power that had been stolen from the people. But Jasmine knew that this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be long and filled with obstacles. There would be pushback. There would be attempts to discredit her, to silence her once more. But for the first time, the public had been awakened. The truth was no longer something that could be easily ignored or swept under the rug. The fight for integrity, for transparency had begun, and Jasmine had ignited the spark that would burn through the political landscape, one truth at a time. The final moments of the broadcast echoed in Jasmine's mind, the weight of her words still hanging in the air. The truth that has been hidden can sleep for a while, but when it's awakened at the right time, it can shake the entire system. She knew that the truth was a powerful force, one that could not be contained once it was set free, and now the system would have to reckon with its own truth. Jasmine had done what so many had feared to do. She had exposed the darkness, and there was no going back. As the days passed since Jasmine's explosive revelations, the political landscape began to shift beneath Lindsey Graham's feet. The fallout from the exposure of his financial ties and backdoor deals was swift and unforgiving. One by one, the allies he had once relied on began to peel away, distancing themselves from him in a calculated move to save their own political skins. The weight of his scandals had become a liability too great to carry, and those who had once rallied behind him now found themselves publicly denouncing his actions. Former colleagues, the ones who had helped elevate him to power, began to turn their backs in droves, recognizing the political death sentence attached to aligning with him any longer. The first blow came when several prominent Republican senators, who had long stood by Graham, issued a joint statement calling for him to step down. They no longer could afford the stain of his compromised position. "I can no longer stand behind a man who has failed to hold himself to the standards we all agreed upon," one of the senators declared in a televised interview. The statement was a cold, calculated move, a rejection of Graham's leadership in a favor of self-preservation. It wasn't personal, it was pragmatic. But the sting of betrayal was palpable as Graham's former allies moved swiftly to sever all ties, erasing any trace of loyalty to him as if it had never existed. Jasmine watched the shift with a mixture of satisfaction and resolve. The cracks in Graham's armor were widening, but she knew this was just the beginning. She had never expected a swift victory. What she was witnessing now was merely the first step toward the real change that needed to come. The true test would be in the actions taken next, the willingness of the political establishment to reform itself in the wake of the truth she had exposed. As her files continued to make headlines, more and more members of Congress began to speak out in support of transparency. A few brave senators, especially those from the more moderate factions of both parties, announced they would voluntarily begin audits of their financial dealings. "If we are to lead by example, we must show that we are committed to the highest standards of integrity," one prominent senator proclaimed as he stood in front of cameras, his words echoing through the chambers of power. The rhetoric sounded good, but Jasmine wasn't fooled. The path to genuine reform was still obscured by decades of corruption and complacency. These announcements of self-auditing felt more like damage control than a true commitment to change. Jasmine knew that the establishment would never reform itself unless it was pushed, relentlessly. As the public began to digest the implications of the scandal, her calls for widespread reform grew louder. She knew that the fight was far from over, and despite the growing support for her cause, she refused to celebrate what some saw as a victory. Her focus had always been on justice, not political theater. The self-congratulations of those jumping on the reform bandwagon left her cold. For her, the real battle was in making sure that the system, as corrupt and broken as it was, could be fixed for good. Sitting at her desk in the office, Jasmine reflected on the words she had just heard from the latest batch of newly self-reflective lawmakers. She didn't feel the satisfaction she expected. There was no victory in this for her, not yet. The realization hit her like a wave. Justice was not a victory. It was a process, a long and painstaking journey of undoing the wrongs that had been done. And the only way to achieve that was through constant, relentless pursuit. Justice was not about the public applause, not about the accolades. It was about making sure that what had been broken could be put back together, piece by piece. She stood up, pacing back and forth in the quiet of her office, her mind running through the next steps. Victory is not in what has been accomplished today, she murmured aloud to herself. It's in the work that still lies ahead. Her thoughts drifted to the faces of the people she had met during her rise, the ones who had lost faith in a system that had abandoned them, the ones who still held out hope that their government could be a force for good. Their faces fueled her determination. She wouldn't rest until the systemic corruption had been eradicated, until transparency and accountability became the law of the land. In front of her, the papers from Graham's case remained stacked high on her desk, each document a reminder of what had been done, what still needed to be done. They were more than just evidence now. They were a symbol of a broken system that had betrayed the public trust. Each page carried the weight of a nation's hopes for justice, the dreams of millions who wanted to believe that their leaders were working for them, not for their own self-interest. But Jasmine had come to understand something that few others had. Change was a slow burn, and it required patience, strategy, and an unrelenting commitment to the truth. The media, still buzzing with the aftermath of Graham's fall from grace, continued to highlight Jasmine's role in the unfolding scandal. Her face had become a fixture on the news, her every word dissected, her every move scrutinized. She had become the face of this fight for justice, and while the attention was welcome, it was never her motivation. It wasn't about her, it was about the country, about the people who had been left behind. It was about ensuring that the next generation of leaders understood the weight of their responsibility. It was about making sure that no one else would have to fight this battle again. "I'm not done yet," Jasmine muttered under her breath. The world would soon learn that this was only the beginning. With the pressure mounting on the establishment, she knew that the next few weeks would be critical. She needed to keep pushing, to keep the pressure on Graham and anyone else who thought they could get away with corruption. Jasmine wasn't in this for the applause. She wasn't in this for the political gain. She was in this because the system had failed the people for too long. And while some might celebrate the public accountability of a few lawmakers, Jasmine knew that true reform would only come when the system was held accountable as a whole. She had taken down one powerful man, but the fight was far from over. What came next would determine whether this was a mere momentary shift in the tides or the beginning of a full-scale overhaul of the political system itself. Justice, she thought again, was not about victory. It was about correcting the wrongs, bringing the truth to light, and ensuring that those who had been complicit could no longer hide behind their positions of power. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the city, Jasmine knew that the path ahead would be difficult, but she was ready for it, and with every step she would make sure that the truth would be heard, no matter how loud the opposition became. As the political drama continued to unfold, an unexpected twist came when a former advisor to Lindsey Graham appeared on live television, shaking the very foundation of Graham's defense. The advisor, a man who had remained in the shadows for years, sat in front of the cameras with a stern expression, a mixture of guilt and resolve in his eyes. The moment was heavy with anticipation, the weight of the truth about to be revealed in front of millions. The nation watched, knowing that this man was about to drop a bombshell that could change everything. The advisor's voice was calm, yet the words he spoke were laced with a quiet intensity that cut through the air. "I was asked by Lindsey Graham to silence a witness, to make sure they never spoke a word of what they knew," he confessed, his eyes flicking nervously toward the camera, as if the very act of exposing the truth was both a relief and a burden. The admission sent shockwaves through the room, through the media, and across the nation. Graham, who had long been a powerful and untouchable figure in politics, was now linked to an act of obstruction that threatened to unravel everything he had worked to conceal. The revelation was a gut punch to the public. But it was Jasmine Crockett who had inspired this brave man to come forward. At the time, I kept quiet. I thought it was the right thing to do. The only thing I could do, the advisor continued, his voice cracking slightly as he recalled the weight of his silence. But when I saw Jasmine stand up, I knew I had to speak the truth. I couldn't be part of this anymore. The sincerity in his words was undeniable, and it hit Jasmine like a wave of both vindication and sorrow. She had known all along that there were others out there, men and women who had been complicit in the corruption, but she never expected one of them to step forward like this. Her relentless pursuit of the truth had created a ripple effect, one that was forcing others to confront their own choices. The emotional gravity of the moment settled over the crowd like a storm cloud. It wasn't just one man speaking out. It was the beginning of a movement. Jasmine had become a symbol of the fight for justice, for accountability, and for a system that could no longer afford to turn a blind eye to corruption. The public was now fully awake, their trust in the political system shattered, and their demand for accountability growing louder by the second. As the advisor's words hung in the air, the media exploded with coverage. The networks replayed the footage of his confession on a loop, the shock and disbelief evident in the faces of viewers as they processed the magnitude of what had just been said. But the effects didn't stop there. In the days that followed, the floodgates opened. Emails, documents, and personal testimonies began pouring in from all corners of the country. Citizens, outraged by the scandal, reached out to the investigation with their own pieces of the puzzle. Each story, each document adding weight to the growing case against Graham. Jasmine sat at her desk, watching the news unfold before her eyes. It was happening faster than she had anticipated. People were no longer afraid to speak out. The momentum was shifting. The tide was turning. What had once been a lonely battle now had the support of thousands. The public wasn't just demanding answers anymore. They were actively seeking them out. The investigation was no longer a small group of determined individuals fighting against the machine. It had become a national effort, a collective fight for justice that could no longer be ignored. As the new evidence flooded in, Jasmine's phone rang constantly. Calls from reporters, investigators, and ordinary citizens who had information to share. The walls that had once protected the corrupt were now crumbling. And Graham, though he had tried to hold on to power, was losing control. The truth was no longer something he could suppress. Every call, every email, every document brought more cracks to his foundation. His world, once built on secrecy and lies, was collapsing under the weight of the truth that Jasmine had forced into the open. Jasmine didn't celebrate. She didn't feel the rush of triumph that many might have expected. For her, this wasn't about winning. It was about righting a wrong. The journey wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. The fight for justice had only just begun. And while the first victories were being won, Jasmine knew that the real challenge lay ahead. She couldn't let the momentum slip away. The battle for transparency, for a system that operated with integrity, was far from won. But there was no denying that something had shifted. The people were speaking, and for the first time in years, their voices were being heard. The truth, which had long been buried and ignored, was now exposed, and the system would have to reckon with it. The fight that Jasmine had started was no longer just her fight. It was the fight of the people, a movement that could no longer be contained. The question now was, how far would it go? And how many more would join the call for justice, for accountability, and for a government that served its people, not its own interests? As the investigation unfolded, a new chapter was written in the fight for justice. The Congress established the Integrity Oversight Council, with Jasmine Crockett named as a founding member. Her face appeared on TV screens across the nation, her voice steady but filled with unshakable resolve. "I am not chasing Lindsey Graham. I am chasing the truth," she declared, her words echoing in every home. The room fell silent, the weight of her declaration hanging heavily in the air. With the camera zooming in, she added, "Truth is not a weapon. It is an invitation for all of us to make things right." Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.